Hi, good morning. This is Leah Guidry. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. This is Leah Guidry. Welcome and apologies for a little bit of technical challenges that we're having this morning with sound. I want to welcome everyone to Huron's 2020 Research Compliance webinar series, and happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Good morning, certainly, to those of you in the Pacific and Mountain time zones, and good afternoon to those of you in the central and eastern portions of the country. At this session this morning and afternoon is about programmatic versus operational compliance. We'll talk a bit more as we walk through this about what we mean by that. I am joined, if we can advance the slides, I want to introduce the panelists today and talk through a couple of things to expect. Later in today's session, you'll hear more about the webinar series. Anne is going to provide the topics that we'll be discussing at the end of the session. I also want to alert everyone that there are various polling questions throughout the session. I really encourage you to complete those and participate in today's webinar, and it will help guide the discussion. So go ahead and advance the slide. I want to introduce those that you're seeing the pictures of on the previous slide. As I mentioned, my name is Leah Guidry. I'm delighted to be here to discuss this particular topic. And joining us today is Dr. Tim Fournier, who is a former Huron colleague and dear friend who has very deep experience in this area and with this particular topic. And as you can see from the slide here, Tim has a very large role at Rutgers. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Executive in charge of enterprise risk management, ethics, risk, audit, and compliance. So quite a large role, but has really deep insight into the discussion that we'll have today. So his perspective is invaluable. We're also joined today by Ann Pifer, who is a Senior Director in Huron's Research Services team. Ann co-leads our research compliance team and is a tremendously talented colleague whose experience in grants and contracts management is unparalleled in the industry. Ann has been at the forefront of many investigations that have resulted in government settlements, but at a significant reduction to what the initial demand was. Ann's experience is really deep and rich in this area. And I'm Leah Guidry, and I specialize in clinical research compliance, and like Ann, have been involved in many research investigations and settlements, mainly around research billing compliance. So let's go ahead and get started. So part of what we'll do today is the agenda that you see on the screen now. I will do the overview and set the foundation for the discussion and talking about compliance, programmatic and operational compliance. Then we'll talk about compliance programs in higher ed, again, building on that foundation. And then we'll shift to Ann, who will talk about some effective structures and programs of what we've seen. Tim will talk about sample models, and then we'll do some discussion about focus topics that Tim will also cover, and then we'll have Q&A. The Q&A button you'll see on your screen. Please feel free to add your questions in throughout the session. And let's go ahead and get started.
Leah, I'd like to just throw in one comment so everyone knows the session today is being recorded and will be distributed to all the registered attendees, I believe next week. So just so everyone's aware.
Great, Tim. Thank you so much for that. Yes, Tim is right. You'll get a link, and then in that link, you'll get not just a replay of the session, but also the slides will be embedded, because people will often ask, can I get these slides? And yes, you can through that link. So what do we mean when we talk about the word compliance. It is oftentimes quite confusing to understand exactly what someone means when they talk about compliance. One of the things that we discuss internally at Huron is this concept of little c compliance versus big C compliance. And what we mean by that is that little c compliance is more about adherence to rules and regulations. In any highly regulated field, of which healthcare, higher ed, and research is, there are aspects of compliance that are just embedded in the day-to-day obligations of your role or your job. No one can escape this, and no one can escape the need to learn and adhere to the regulatory structures of their job. That's what we mean when we talk about little c compliance. The broader programmatic aspects of compliance, or big C, is the program or departmental compliance within an organization that actually helps to create the atmosphere for ethics and integrity that enables people to more easily do the right thing. So it supports you in that compliance or that adherence to those rules and regulations, and helps you adhere in the individual attention to that. The former big C compliance certainly helps support, or the big C compliance helps to support the little c compliance. So take a look at the descriptions we have here. The left side of the screen will talk about more the little c or adherence aspects of our jobs. The statutes and laws, the rules and regulations, but it's also the policies and standard operating procedures that you have internal to your organization, the requirements and the things that we must comply with in order to adhere. The right side of the slide are more about the big C compliance aspects, the programmatic aspects. These are the things that Tim is responsible for in his job at Rutgers. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about big C compliance throughout the session. And we'll talk in more detail later about compliance and or ethics and integrity programs within your institutions and the detailed components and elements of those and what the government is looking at and expecting to help support people in doing their jobs and in finding and guiding the right course of action.
You know, Leah, when I think about this little c versus big C compliance, on the little c side, you know, it's pretty clear that these are the laws, regulations, policies, the rules to which we have to adhere. On the big C side, it's really about, from my perspective, partnering with the people in our organizations to set those expectations for behavior on a practical level, and that culture of the institution has a huge impact on setting those expectations and the impact on the structure for compliance in the organization. A big part of that big C compliance has a certain element of a need for true self-awareness about the realities of how each of our organizations communicates expectations and how we get the community to understand it.
Tim, thank you for those comments. And it's such an important point. And one of the areas that you have such deep experience in, having been a compliance officer or integrity officer at a number of different higher ed institutions. And it helps to have your thinking in this area of the distinction between what you're describing in your role as helping to build the culture of integrity and ethics and compliance versus having individuals in the organization from leadership on down, essentially assigning to you, you're responsible for compliance, as if all of the adherence responsibilities for everyone in the organization somehow, you know, ends at or lands at your doorstep. Speak for just a moment about that distinction, if you would.
You know, and we're going to come to it later, but you know, I was sort of laughing when you said this notion of having it all land at my doorstep. Some days it feels like that, and all of us who are on this this session who sit in the compliance roles at our institutions. I think sometimes we feel that way, right? That leadership and our boards are pointing to us as compliance officers to fix all the problems. The reality, though, and we all talk about this notion of compliance being everyone's responsibility. I really do believe it is. The ability for a single compliance officer or even a larger compliance unit to ensure compliance throughout, it's impossible, and it's unreasonable to expect that. What we do need to do, though, is set those expectations and move the culture so that the operational, the people in operational roles and operational managers make that a daily part of what they do. And I think in a little bit, we're going to get to some practical examples of that as well.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. So let's look for just a moment. You can read along with some of the items that we've identified as consequences of noncompliance. And this actually is true for both aspects of compliance. The little c adherence, things go awry or, are out of bounds, and that gets embedded, and you end up doing something wrong over a long period of time, and that hasn't been detected. There are consequences of that, and there are problems of that, for sure. Fines, penalties, costly investigations, audit findings that impair really future projects with funding agencies, and whether you may end up with additional terms and conditions or inability to contract with these funding agencies or win awards. And then there's also reputational risk to the organization in a public way, or internal reputational impacts based on things being publicized internally in terms of audit findings or issues or investigations that are being broadcasted to leadership and governing bodies. These are significant, and things that most of us want to avoid in our day-to-day efforts. So let's go ahead and move. We're going to have our first polling question. So we really invite you to participate. And the question is, does your organization have a big C, programmatic, institutional compliance program? You can click on your answer that yes, your program covers all the institutional needs, both at the university level and any healthcare provision or area within the academic medical center. It's a single program. Or it covers institutional compliance needs independent of an academic medical center and healthcare compliance program. So they're separate. The answer might be no, you don't have any programmatic compliance. Know that you're considering one. So there's discussion about that. And then maybe you don't know the answer to that. So click on, go ahead, Tim.
As people are thinking through this, I think it's important that we recognize that the notion of this label of big C and little c is not intended to put a priority or a value judgment on different parts of our responsibilities. Because we call it little c when we're talking about the actual laws, regulations, and policies, that doesn't mean they're not important or less important. It's just a different way of categorizing the sort of defined expectations for us versus how we address it.
That's such an excellent point, Tim. And I think that, without both working together, you're really not fully utilizing and fully realizing the benefits of compliance and ethics programs. Okay, I think we're going to end the poll and show the results so that people can see the information from the audience standpoint. So it looks like certainly a plurality, almost 50%, 48% of you have that big C institutional programmatic compliance program that covers the entirety of the organization. And some of you, a quarter, actually have separate programs that address the needs of both. And then the remaining roughly quarter don't have one, or considering establishing one, or just don't know yet for your organization. So this will be an interesting and useful session to talk through some of the aspects of compliance, big C and little c, more programmatic adherence. So now that we've set the foundation for big C versus little c, let's shift to an industry perspective. It is certainly true that when we look at this Venn diagram, there's higher education, healthcare, and then there's kind of the broad overarching corporate aspects of it. You know, some industries have more robust compliance requirements with pretty strong internal controls, kind of an auditing term. If you think about the banking industry as one, kind of outside of the purview of what we're talking about here in terms of industries, you know, we all have experience of detection of fraudulent activity on our credit cards, and bank alerts that come to us through maybe text messages or alerts on our apps that root out that fraud and put a stop to it before damage is done. But then, so that's kind of somewhat about an internal control or adherence. That's kind of a stop loss for the bank, since they're responsible. You as the credit card holder are not responsible for that fraudulent activity. But then take that same industry and note the challenges of systematic and ongoing business activities that really belie a true culture of ethics and integrity. When you think about the incident several years ago of Wells Fargo's creation of over 1 million fraudulent accounts, and when that was detected, and how challenging that was when that became public. So it's you know, this distinction is important. And I think one of the things that we see when we look at the higher ed industry, we can go ahead and advance the slide. When we look at the higher ed industry, it's actually relatively young when you think about compliance as a profession overall. And certainly compliance within higher ed is younger and newer than compliance in this more traditional healthcare space, often driven by US, the OIG compliance guidances and US sentencing guidelines that Ann's going to talk a bit more about later in the session. And then there's this issue that we've talked about already of this tendency to conflate operational structures that require regulatory adherence with the big C compliance programs. But that big C compliance programs, and Tim will talk about this in his comments, really of this need for independent and objective oversight. You know, there's an old audit concept of you can't audit your own work. There's a need to have kind of a broader view of the organization in its totality, not just to help build that culture that Tim was talking about earlier, but really to have a broader and a long view of what the organization is doing more broadly to ensure that there's compliance across the organization.
You know what's funny, Leah, I couldn't agree more with your comment about in higher education, we're still a relatively young industry when it comes to compliance programs and the compliance aspect of what we do. But what's funny is that, to me, is that you think about our industry hasn't changed a whole lot in about 600 years, right? The same sort of didactic approach to pedagogy has existed in the great universities of Europe, was brought here, and in the US, of course, we began the tradition of the research university, but the core model still remains. So from my perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges we have in introducing this notion of a compliance culture results from our need to work in fundamentally different ways from what we've done in the past. And that's a challenge for institutions that have long lives like we do.
Tim, thank you for that. It's such an important perspective to maintain and help us manage our own expectations of ourselves as you're thinking about the length of that history. And higher ed is incredibly complex. You know, we talk about it as, quote, higher education, but the institutions are incredibly complex. And it's a complicated area in which to practice as a compliance professional. You think about the constituencies that you were dealing with and managing and working with, and they're anything but monolithic. You have student bodies, parents, faculty senate, boards, other internal governing aspects. You have state and federal oversight bodies, and then you have other outside influences like advocacy groups. And all of these constituents have their unique needs and expectations. And many times those expectations and frankly, the needs don't align. And so it's difficult to find compromise or the right aspect of, you know, what should the policy be? How should we move forward with this particular area? And then in addition to all of that, you also have just the complexity of the issues that are found. Just in one aspect, research alone, genomics, stem cell research, clinical trials, tech transfer, faculty-owned startups, university equity interest in those startups, conflicts of interest and commitment, internal collaboration, subcontracts, just the list goes on and on. It is incredibly difficult. So for those of you on the call that are finding things challenging, to take heart that it's a difficult job, it's challenging, but that there are resources and help out there, and we're hoping to be able to provide some of that detail in the session today. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Ann Pifer, who will talk more about effective models and structures. Ann?
Thanks, Leah. Now that we've established the definitions of big C and little c compliance, really have set that foundation that Leah and Tim walked through about what it looks like in today's landscape, we're going to spend a few minutes discussing the big C compliance a bit more and what that institutional compliance program looks like and why it has an impact on an organization. And then really most importantly, the how can it be structured to enable and support compliance? So first of all, as we're thinking bigger picture about the reasons for an institutional compliance program, let's consider what the benefits are. The benefits ideally would align with your institutional strategy, goals, and culture. But the benefits, when we think about them, are really four here as well as many others. But the four I want to highlight is that establishing a compliance program can serve as a proactive approach towards managing risk. And the goal is really to be out ahead of your institutional risks and then work with your operational leaders to set up proactive measures and activities and be in that proactive mode rather than always serving in a reactive mode to an incident of non-compliance. Because inevitably the incidents will happen, non-compliance will happen, but you want to be as proactive as possibly to be prepared. And at the same time, you want to try to avoid unnecessary constraints or impediments to the operations. So there's really a balance that has to be struck in the compliance program to manage the risk. You want to be proactive, but you also want to enable the units to function and manage their own risks in their normal operations and really partner with that little c compliance. With that, an institution of higher education certainly has significant inherent risks as part of its operations. And a compliance program that we're talking about will not eliminate those risks, certainly, but it can help reduce the risk of non-compliance. And we're going to talk about the elements of the program that make it effective at reducing the actual non-compliance when it does happen. The program can also reduce the impact when non-compliance is discovered. Again, there will be risks, there will be likely incidents of non-compliance, but in our experience working with institutions, when dealing with incidents or when dealing with federal investigators, OIG, Department of Justice, a mitigating factor or a sign of a strength of an organization can be having a compliance program. You know, that it's an opportunity to demonstrate to a federal body that the institution takes seriously its responsibilities to the federal agencies and has an established program that will help address corrective actions and has enforcement. And in our experience, it really has been a factor that's been considered by Department of Justice or other agencies when they're doing investigations and determining corrective actions. And when we kind of go work with the institutions that we're dealing with investigations, we really help to look across the compliance program and identify where those strengths are that we can capitalize on in communications with the federal agencies to communicate what's working well and areas that we know we need to continue to improve. But OIG, Department of Justice, they often ask for descriptions of your controls, your monitoring mechanisms, policies and procedures that are accessible, and roles and responsibilities. So the compliance program can help reduce really that negative impact of not having those in place. If you do not have those in place or wouldn't have a way to communicate those, it can help coordinate that response. And then if set up appropriately, the compliance program can provide the clarity and accountability for the compliance requirements across the institution. And Tim, you already hit upon this already, that just establishing what the responsibilities and requirements are and identifying those and communicating them is a big step and sometimes is a big barrier to cross. And it's really predicated on strong communication from the compliance program and then clearly defined roles in the organization. And the last thing you want, I think Tim and Leah have already impressed upon this point, is the last thing you want is leadership or operational units thinking that compliance is only the compliance program or the compliance officer's responsibility. And the compliance program can really help establish the responsibilities for all who have a role.
You know, and one of my favorite parts of this slide that you have is in the upper left where you say managing compliance risk. You recognize that the proactive approach allows us all to manage our risk without imposing unnecessary constraints on the institution's operations. I think that last part is one of the greatest challenges that we face as compliance professionals within institutions, because no matter what we try to put in place, there are going to be people who do perceive that anything that we try to use to guide behaviors and activities in a compliant direction is a quote unquote unnecessary constraint. I think to me, one of the biggest differences between that little c compliance and big C compliance that we're talking about is how to get those new guideposts in place, or guardrails maybe are what we really should call them, in place in our compliance program in a way that our constituents throughout the university really are embracing it, understanding it, and adhering to it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, Tim, and I think that the challenge of that balance is really critical and important to consider. Particularly, I think it's one thing to identify when you have risks, and that can be done in partnership with the operational units, but to establish those guardrails becomes a real benefit to those units and to the institution when something does happen. Because as we all know, many of the cases we see or issues of non-compliance and the headlines and settlements we see are because somebody may have identified something, but it wasn't communicated or properly handled internally. So the compliance program in an effective structure can help set those guardrails about what to do when inevitably something happens. So I think that's the value that needs to be expressed to those who have compliance responsibilities in the unit. So as we talk about the effective structures and programs, it's really talking about the how. How can the compliance program be effective at managing the risk, reducing the risk, and managing the impact of noncompliance? And we do have a set of guidelines that within the industry that institutions use, and the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines were established by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and they were also adopted by the DHHS Office of Inspector General, or OIG. And these were created or drafted a number of years ago to promote voluntary compliance programs. And they are not mandatory, so I want to point that out, but they were never formalized or finalized, but they do serve as the standards or set of guidelines that are applied in the industry. And this set of elements really give an indication of the government's expectations. And they, in fact, the government agencies utilize these elements in their work and their reviews that they do. And sometimes we hear reference to either 7 or 8 elements, depending on the draft of guidelines that you look at. And in our perspective, at Huron, we recommend the 8th element there of roles and responsibilities, that be really integrated and part of all elements, but really be integrated within the program. So compliance leadership, policies, procedures, training, communication, monitoring, enforcement, corrective response, roles and responsibilities. It's a lot to be effective, to be good at all of this. But that's not to say that the institutional compliance program, or the Big C, has primary responsibility for developing and implementing all of this, for developing and implementing actual training sessions or monitoring mechanisms, or in fact writing the policies. The compliance program really needs to partner with the operational units and the little c units who carry out the compliance responsibilities. So the overarching compliance program really needs to ensure these mechanisms are in place, these elements are in place, but that there is an integrated plan, such as an integrated training program or a method for updating and accessing policy information, ensuring that monitoring auditing is being conducted, and that there's a clear response process when a problem is detected, and so on. And those are some examples of how a compliance program would support. Let's focus on the on one sample element, or highlight the element of compliance leadership, just as an example. In our experience, ineffective compliance programs sometimes include those that don't have a compliance officer, or someone, or maybe they do have a compliance officer, but it does not have sufficient authority within the institution to be effective. Another common oversight or challenge can be a lack of coordination among several individuals who have roles and responsibilities for compliance. So they may all be doing similar activities, but not coordinating. Or a compliance officer may be in place, but it doesn't have a sufficient staff, either a number of expertise, to reasonably or feasibly carry out the elements of the program. And I want to point out that models will look very different institution to institution, as we've already pointed out. So these are really general oversights we have seen and some best practices, but this doesn't mean it will work at a central compliance officer must be in place at your institution, or that it will always be effective. This is really to provide some general guidelines around some of the experiences that we have seen. But in terms of best practice, the compliance officer who has broad responsibility for compliance and then reports directly to executive leadership or governing authority can be effective. And Tim is going to talk about reporting lines and structures in a few minutes and why that's critical to be effective. But it's really important to establish that accessibility to executive leadership and authority. And then oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was interrupting, sorry.
No, I was going to point out that considering a compliance committee too can help support the culture of compliance and provide that avenue of communication along leadership. And then, it's also beneficial to consider the responsibilities for different types of operations and compliance of the organization, and where there may be need for more specific expertise to work side by side with operations, such as if you have a research compliance officer or health officer or health system compliance officer. Tim, you want to jump in?
I'm thinking a little bit about the those who responded that they're not sure, or their institutions are just thinking about moving into a compliance program, or maybe they want the compliance program to be enhanced or think it should be. When I think about those organizations, I think one of the tests that we generally apply is, how would you respond to an investigator from the Office of Inspector General who's coming to look at your compliance program? How would you describe and document the existence of compliance leadership? How would you demonstrate and document, how would you communicate the existence of roles and responsibilities and their ability to meet the expectations of laws, regulations, and policies? And I think that's critically important, But one of the things I've found at my time, both as a consultant and in institutions, is that we tend to do better if we ask another question on top of that, not just what would an oversight investigator ask and what would we tell them, but what would our colleagues in our own institution say? Sometimes when I think about different colleges and universities, my counterpart at that institution might very clearly be able to say, well, you know, I'm the compliance officer for the organization. I report to the board and the president. I have, you know, this authority to go out and make recommendations or evaluate the level of compliance throughout the organization. But then if I go to a dean or a chair at one of the schools in the same institution, their response might be, you know, I really don't know who to go to. I really don't know what we have in place to address the expectations for compliance. I don't know what we do to monitor. And those responses say as much to an oversight agency and to our own self-assessment of the program as do our responses in compliance and senior leadership. If you're thinking about moving your program forward, the ability to educate and increase awareness throughout the institution is essential.
Thanks, Tim. That's exactly some of the things we wanted to press upon around how you can assess your compliance environment, and really whether you have that institutional compliance program or compliance adherence out in the operations. It's really important to assess how you're doing across all of those elements. Should you have to answer to it later, but certainly to do that internal exercise to see how much awareness there is. So I think you've hit upon some of the things I was going to note around, you know, that this can sometimes be a significant barrier to overcome depending on your culture, and getting out there and understanding who understands the scope of the program, that it even exists, its purpose and its value, and how it can support the whole institution. And really having commitment from the institutional's leadership to champion the initiatives from compliance has been really critical in our experience. Some of the other things to consider too is, you know, not only the staffing levels for those within a compliance office, but as you develop a compliance program, do you have sufficient resources out in the units to carry out their responsibilities? If a compliance program is defining the requirements for the institution, can they actually even be achieved if you don't have the staffing and resources available to help develop policies or deliver training and education, or to be really those compliance liaisons out in the operations to support us.
Hey, Anne.
Yeah.
We have a few questions, and one of them is talking about some other C's in the compliance area. One is communication, and the other is collaboration. I think that Tim touched a bit on collaboration. Could you speak a bit to communication and some things that you've seen be successful of communicating either compliance expectations or information about the program, like what Tim is describing as the distinction between the responses that an investigator might receive?
Sure, great question. So in terms of the communication, it is sort of that sometimes can feel intangible. You know, how do we be effective at our communication and get out to all of those constituents that you listed, Leah, on the previous page, and how do we do that in different ways? And I think that in some ways you have to think about how you tailor your communications to those different constituents and what's most important to them. But in most cases we've seen, or in effective cases we have seen, in establishing a compliance officer, or if one is established and there's a need for greater communication, really thinking about where you can get in front of that audience and working with the executive leadership or the leadership out there in the units to be a part of their already established meetings, or you know, having avenues to communicate with them in person, and having that face-to-face, I think, has been what we hear and recommend as you know, the best form of communication and getting in front of people. But communicating, I think, also is about tools and providing resources. And I think that's what we hear a lot from constituents is, oh, I know we have a compliance program, but I'm not getting anything that's helpful to me or adding value to me on my day-to-day to help identify or mitigate risk. So thinking about what types of resources or tools are out there that can be shared, and that can be even, tools and resources that you put on the website that are accessible easily, or if there's things that you, other types of newsletters or direct communications or emails that need to be sent around, but just thinking about all the various formats and methods that could be used. And I don't know, Tim, if you have any examples of what you use for Rutgers.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to go back to a couple of institutions. So the prior institution that was struggling a little bit with how we improve the compliance culture, one of the things that we did is create a pretty formalized compliance network. And that network included people who served as the sort of early warning mechanism on changes in their operational areas that might have impact across the institution. But we also used it as a resource sharing so that different individuals, operational individuals in different units could come together. We'd facilitate the conversation and then use that to help develop a level of shared practices across the institution to improve consistency, to increase awareness, to improve individual knowledge of how to address compliance issues. And then also, to the point you mentioned, provided that network with tools and templates to be able to address core issues. So, for example, one of the practices that we had, and every major research university has, is recharge centers that support research. And many of these are smaller centers that are created because there's a specialized piece of equipment or service. And so we developed tools and templates for rate calculation and ensuring that we break even over time, and also tools associated with that would allow the center to create a different rate structure for non-federal external purchasers of those services, and then created the accounting tools and structures so that they could, A, they'd be compliant, and B, they could run their business in a new and different way. So, those kinds of creative ways of bringing tools and information to operational individuals is pretty effective.
Great, thanks, Tim. And we wanted to provide some sample criteria to consider when you're evaluating your compliance program. And again, this makes, we're providing just a sample scorecard, and you'll have it in the material that we distribute that will be posted. But this is really just examples to identify where you may have strengths and weaknesses among those 8 elements we talked about. And I think I just want to reiterate what Tim said earlier, is that if you're a compliance officer or have some sort of role within either Big C or Little C compliance, and you look across these elements and you can kind of do that internal scorecard for yourself on how things are going, that's great if you have a perspective on strengths and weaknesses across these. But I think what's really helpful to identify gaps or to strengthen your communication and coordination is to get input from the other stakeholders or constituents about the awareness of the program, how they would rank you across those 8 elements, to help give an indication of what's strong and what's weak, and what you can improve upon going forward. But I think thinking not only about how you perceive or you score internally in your role, but doing that across the institution in some way informs the focus areas.
One of the other challenges in this kind of self-assessment is also digging down, right? So let's just pull, there's consistent enforcement of policies in instances of non-compliance, the second element on the slide here. From an institutional level, we might have a perspective about this, and might even have data that show that we can evaluate across the entire organization. But when we dig down more deeply into certain subunits, we might find that even though on average over the whole institution there's consistent enforcement, within a particular school, they could be an outlier in terms of their response. So digging down more deeply is also an essential component of determining whether our compliance program is actually working to change culture and become more effective.
Okay, great. So we're going to take another poll here. And as you know, as we transition to talking more about the structures and ownership of compliance, we'd like you to gauge the type of compliance program you currently have at your organization, and how centralized do you think your compliance program is? Is it completely decentralized, where some compliance functions may exist in campus or schools and units, and they have primary compliance oversight functions? Is it some of a hybrid where compliance functions may exist within the school level, but you also have an institution-wide compliance officer who has oversight? Or is it completely centralized where a compliance officer oversees activities for the institution? And if you don't know, there's an option there too. Take a second and complete the poll, please.
And as you're thinking about it, we did get a question about the representation and composition of a compliance committee for research. From my perspective, and I don't, Leah and I don't know if you share this response, but I'm going to say it depends. And as all of you stop laughing here in a second, the reason I say that is because it's really highly dependent on the organization and the size of the research enterprise. So that the composition is going to differ in different places, but from a general rule of thumb, I like to see, in addition to representatives from research, I like to see representatives from procurement, representatives from finance, particularly the controller's office. I tend to like to see people from external affairs, so individuals who are plugged into state and federal happenings to be able to help guide our operational responses to legislative changes. I'm sure I'm missing others, but that's kind of how I would think of it. And the placement of that committee, I think, also varies depending on the institution. In some organizations with a fairly definable research enterprise, I think my view would be that the Research Compliance Committee should be completely managed within research. As you get to a more complex, more diverse and larger organization, you may want to keep it there, but you may also want to take it to an institutional level, because research also touches on our academic activities. It touches on the lives of students. We don't always think about that, right? But most of our organizations have undergraduate and certainly graduate students working in the lab. So going to a broader representation and an institutional placement, I think, can work very well for a larger, more complex organization.
Yeah, you know, Tim, those comments are just spot on. And thinking about that "it depends" answer, one of the things that we look at when we evaluate compliance programs is the culture of the organization in which that compliance program is operating, to some of your earlier points. And research is really important and sometimes a good lens through which to evaluate this, because in our view, you're trying to balance a specialized area with specialized knowledge, and a research compliance committee and a research compliance officer can actually serve those needs. And that is highly valuable in certain organizations and really necessary. But the counterbalance to that is ensuring that issues that are taught about and uncovered and dealt with and investigated in those research compliance programs and by those research compliance officers are linked up and connected to the broader institutional compliance program. So, you know, while Tim, I'm going to use you as an example, you may have a research compliance committee with a research compliance officer that's dealing with all that, but are you getting that information? Is it coming up to you so that in your broader view, you're able to evaluate from an enterprise level what responses and reactions need to be, where policy changes may need to take place, that research compliance committee and officer is not operating in a silo?
You're raising a great point, Leah, and I think the challenge again is going to be not only is the information rising to the level of an institutional compliance function, is it also the right information? Do we have the right people plugged in at the operational level to actually see what the real challenges are? I know a few of my colleagues here at Rutgers from the research enterprise are on the webinar as well, and I hope they'd agree when I say that we've created a structure with an institutional compliance officer focused on research, who, because we've embedded that individual with in this case her colleagues in the Office for Research and Economic Development, she's able to get a better handle on the real practices and can be more effective then in making recommendations about how to ensure our ongoing compliance. But it all depends. I will very directly say that structure I don't believe would have worked at my prior institutions.
Great, so let's go ahead and take a look at our results of the poll of what you think your, how centralized you think your compliance program is. And it looks like 60% of the respondents said that hybrid, which is not surprising to me, but with another 21% is completely centralized. And then we do have one other quick poll question about and follow up to
actually,
that.
Andy, before you leave that, I'm sorry, Ann, so I'm sort of chuckling again. I'm not surprised at the results at all. I'm actually surprised that it wasn't a little higher than 60% who said they had a hybrid. I was chuckling a little bit because I think the hybrid answer is all of your version of it depends.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough.
And then our final question then is, just in follow-up to that, is how centralized do you think your compliance program should be? So you told us how it is today, but how do you think it should be in the future? So go ahead and take that, and we'll quickly look at the results here.
It's funny when I look at different institutions, I find a lot of top leaders who think about compliance programs and say we want it to be, or it should be, very highly centralized. And then it makes me think about what that really means, from a resource allocation perspective, from operational responsibility, and for ownership of compliance. And then similarly, at some organizations where when you begin to talk with the folks at the operational level, they tend to say, in my experience, that we think compliance programs should be a little bit more decentralized, right? So there is a different kind of resource question there, particularly when you think about if compliance is going to be, a small part of everyone's job, then how do we ensure that people are really being prepared to assume the greater professional level of responsibilities that exist in compliance functions today?
All right, so let's take a look at our results. So about 67% said hybrid, so jump from the current state was 60%, and the majority of you think it should be that hybrid function. Okay.
I'm actually very glad to see that. To me, the nice thing about the hybrid is that there's a big range in the middle, and we're going to see a slide in a little bit that lays out some of the ends and the big middle, and we'll talk about that. But when we think about models, having the accountability for compliance and that expectation in one's role is far and away the most important aspect of creating an effective compliance program. So, institutional leadership, by definition, they're the central aspect of the institution, and they can't have all of the compliance responsibility because, let's be honest, right? We all know that top leadership doesn't know everything that's going on and can't. And you're all supposed to be laughing at that. That was a little joke, right? On the flip side, when we think about the local level, again, it can't be completely decentralized because we'll have so much differentiation from unit to unit and even individual to individual about how we interpret the little c expectations and apply them from a big C compliance program perspective. And of course, the operations and the college school leadership are sort of that in-between hybrid. So when we think about, on the next slide, when we think about the sample models for compliance, there is a huge range of how we can structure the approaches that we take. And I've been both as a consultant and as an employee, been in organizations that fall in various parts of these scales, some with greater centralization and some with lesser. And what that really means is the compliance function has the ability to make change at an operational level throughout the organization when it's more centralized. Unless your organization is a very centralized organization, my observation also has been that in higher ed that rarely works. Let's think about it, right? So I think it was the founders, so Benjamin Franklin and the Quaker founders of the University of Pennsylvania, who sort of defined Penn as the academic institution, the home of the endless good debate. And there's truth in that, right? From a higher education perspective, we tend to like to think through and talk a lot about various issues, but not always with results. I sat in a meeting yesterday morning. It was a 2-hour meeting, and one of the comments that was made early on was, let's not have this turn into a 2-hour meeting where we all walk away and say, great, we met, but nothing ever happens. And that's a hard thing in higher ed. When there's a lot of decentralization and the culture kind of pulls us away from decision making, that's a big consideration for how we structure our compliance program. Similarly, in the oversight and compliance activities, right, determining what role the compliance officer should play in actually influencing and affecting the behavioral, operational, and policy change, highly dependent on the organization. There are those organizations who would say the compliance function shouldn't be involved in making the change because then they're conflicted in their ability to evaluate its effectiveness later. There are other organizations who say, you know, we're not overstaffed, right? And that's most of our organizations. So how in the world can we make these changes? We need help. You know, I kind of tend to fall in that middle place. I tell my team that, yes, we do exist to evaluate the extent to which we're able to meet the little c expectations, but I also tell them it's our job to help our clients within Rutgers make the changes that they need to make to ensure compliance. So let's take a look at one of the first example models on the next slide. This is the Rutgers function as it stands today. I am very fortunate to have a large team, and it's both the ethics and compliance function of the university and the audit and advisory services function within the university. So we capture a wide variety of the compliance needs for Rutgers. From my perspective, though, I still have to have some differentiation between and among the different functions we provide, because I do need to ensure the independence and integrity of each of those areas. So I do have a group that conducts investigations in response to allegations of wrongdoing. But I also have compliance officers whose job it is to set up those policies, procedures, roles, and responsibilities, ensuring that people have accountability, that we're monitoring and responding to these incidents. So that, you know, this is probably the most centralized compliance structure I've ever seen in higher education. and I tend to believe it works, but of course I'm biased on that. But there are a lot of different models. So let me pause for a second. Ann and Leah, do you have any comments, thoughts about our structure and what you see?
One question that I would ask Tim is just generally about the maturation of compliance programs and ethics programs within the higher education space is, would this model that you have at Rutgers been possible 5 or 10 years ago? Were we even in a place in higher education to be able to convince boards and leaders that a position such as yours is warranted?
So I might take the calendar back a little bit earlier. So my first role like this was close to now 25 years, about 20 years ago. At that point, no, I don't think we could have had anywhere in higher education a structure like Rutgers has today. I laugh a little bit because when you say 5 years ago, that's when this structure essentially was created. But like many institutions, it was created in response to some significant compliance issues. For those who don't know, Rutgers, the Rutgers you see today is the combination of the largest merger of higher education institutions in higher education history in the U.S., merging what had been Rutgers University and the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey. UMDNJ had a corporate integrity agreement, and so a portion of what comprises the current compliance officer had been created in the wake of those issues. The structure that was on the previous slide was created in the wake of another compliance issue and resulted from the board and the president saying, we won't have this again. And they felt at the time that a way to do that would be to have a more centralized compliance function. Does that answer your question, Leah?
It does, and I appreciate it. One of the things that I often talk about with clients is that the best lessons are learned from someone else's mistakes. So for those on the call that might not have the kind
Oh, Leah, we lost you.
Looking out of some pain, maybe. Oh, sorry, guys. Ann, go ahead and take it.
Okay, so I think Tim, I think we've given that example from Rutgers, and this model is, I think, on the page here is pretty similar. We provided a couple example models where that's split out between audit and compliance, and sort of how the committees that support both functions, that's also provided here.
You know, one of the things on this one that this reminds me of, in many institutions I see that have health systems or are affiliated with health systems, I often see a compliance structure that's independent from the compliance structure in the rest of the university, sometimes reporting to the same individual, sometimes reporting to two different places. I think one of the things for anyone who has that structure, I think one of the most important considerations is to make sure that there is communication and collaboration so that institutionally we're responding in similar ways to similar kinds of events. That, to go back, Ann, to your earlier comments, I think is one of the most important parts of demonstrating that our compliance program actually works.
I know we're past our time, so we appreciate everyone that's has been able to stay on the line. We got started late, so we thought we'd try to wrap up and just spend a few minutes on this slide. Tim, if you want to just talk in general about some of the key compliance areas that are on your radar right now.
Yeah, and that, you know, there are things that are always going to be on the radar, things like research misconduct and research compliance in general. Athletics compliance is always going to be on the agenda for a compliance officer in large athletics, D1 athletics institution. Human animal subjects, protection of minors, these are things that are always going to be with us, and I don't want to do anything to suggest they're not important, because they are. But right now in our environment, and both within higher education and more broadly in our society, there are some things that I just see emerging as very challenging. One of those, great example of that is foreign influence reporting earlier this week. I think we all saw some of the challenges with one of our colleague institutions and the arrest of a faculty member. And I think, too, probably most people on this call recognize that Rutgers, my institution, is one of at least 6 that currently is under an investigation from the Department of Education. I can talk about this. It is quite public, for failing to report our foreign transactions over a period of time. So this is an issue that's not going away in the current political and social environment. And it's important that we are looking at these, because it is, yes, our institutions have reputational risk, but as we saw this week, this has an impact on our community members, significant impact that could really damage people in addition to our institutions. I also think that from the perspective of higher education in general, issues related to Title IX and discrimination and harassment in the workplace, workplace violence, retaliation, I think these are emerging as, they've always been very important in our environment. I think over the past 3 to 5 years, they've become increasingly visible, and our institutions have struggled with having a good process in response. We all know that there are regulatory changes that are expected to be imposed very soon, regulatory changes that are going to have unpredictable effects on all of our institutions. I mean, I think we all are planning for these changes, but I really don't think we know what it's going to mean from a cost and process and protection of our students, faculty, and staff perspective yet. And I don't think this is going away in the short term. And then finally, the notion of free speech and academic freedom, these are issues that have always existed for higher education. But I will say, from my perspective, in the past 3 years, these issues seem to have gotten so much more volatile and so much more prevalent, partly because I think we're seeing in a polarized society an increase in hate speech. I think we're seeing a move toward greater belief that individual expression is an essential right. I don't disagree with that, but sometimes that expression is not always channeled in respectful ways. And we're seeing that among students, we're seeing that with our faculty and with our staff. And these issues are also very difficult to deal with when the public looks at a faculty member's academic freedom and academic speech and doesn't always understand what the bounds and what the guidelines and the protections for all parties are. I don't think that's going away either.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that perspective. And I want to wrap up by letting everyone know that we are looking very closely at all of those compliance topics and working closely with institutions across the research environment, in particular around foreign influence and misconduct and integrity and other issues in the research realm. And we are having, as part of our webinar series, we have 2 upcoming webinars that will follow this that you'll see in the coming months, where we're going to sort of step down from this discussion on big C versus little c and talk about research compliance leadership and what that role position looks like. The third webinar, we'll talk about research regulatory and compliance operations, so those that are really the adherence to research regulations and what that looks like around the little c compliance needs. And then I want to point out that we have a research compliance podcast series, and we recently launched the first podcast of the year just earlier this week. And those will be coming frequently. In fact, we have another up and coming podcast on academic espionage. To go back to Tim's point about keeping that on that's certainly on the forefront of the news and everyone's mind. So please look for that. And then I would just ask if you have any feedback on topics for our series that you would like to see in the future, please feel free to reach out to us, and you can also sign up for our subscriptions here at this link below. I want to thank everyone for taking the extra time to stay with us till the end today and learning about this, and thank Leah and Tim for your insights. And we look forward to having you all in the next group on the webinar. Thank you.